Hi, we're gonna have another bit of an unusual format for today's video, and there are gonna be two more of these, by the way. But if you remember on my EU5 video that I released last Thursday for me, who knows when this is going to release, but not too long ago, I mentioned that I was going to briefly cover 3 other runs that I did that I wasn't really able to fully showcase. That's what this is. So I showed you a little bit of Greenland, a little bit of Norway, and a little bit of Scotland. But because all of the footage I'm allowed to show you is entirely contained within that 30-minute video, unfortunately, while I go through this explanation, I don't have anything else that I can actually show you. And to make matters worse, because I played a lot further in that Greenland game than I was able to show you, that footage was pretty much useless. So you're just going to be rewatching the footage of my 30-minute video in the background while this is practically second monitor content. I don't really have any visuals I can show you today, so yeah, just put it on the second monitor, I won't be offended. With that being said, I did still want to go through my process of playing Greenland because I felt it was a pretty interesting and eye-opening one. Since the country starts off so poor and isolated, you really do have to worry about each and every single building and production method that you use. But of course, we'll be getting to that in a moment. For context, I played to, I think in the end, 1517 as Greenland, but I could only show you up to 1437, and I only had a save that was like 1417. This means ultimately that I didn't do a full playthrough, obviously, but I did get to play a little further than most of my campaigns, so that's something, I guess. Anyway, let's talk about Greenland. If you haven't already, I'd recommend going ahead and watching the students' playthrough of Vinland, because that will give you like sort of a gist of what's going on here. The main difference is that for my video today, I'm not restricted by time, so I can just talk about pretty much everything I can remember. So let's start with the geography of Greenland itself. I do have a few screenshots from the Tinto talks, and from what I remember and cross-referencing that with what I see in those Tinto talks, it doesn't look like too much has changed, so they should still be relevant. That being said, Greenland is very mountainous with very few areas that are even available for settlement. You have the main area that you start with that is mostly colonized except for one little tile that's in the east, and then you have this area in the middle that's a little bit more west of your main settlement that is uncolonized. It's called the middle settlement. And then way up in the northwest, you have a few more locations. As far as I can remember, the uncolonized locations start with 0 population, which means if you want to colonize any of them, each tile that you flip to your control is going to require 1,000 population. Now, geographically speaking, Greenland is of course in the Arctic Circle, so all of its climate is Arctic. And while you also have sparse vegetation in Greenland, there is one upside, and that is that not everything is hills or mountains. In fact, luckily, you don't even have any mountains, so it's just hills and flatland. So at the very least, in many places, you do have a somewhat reasonable population capacity, despite the fact that you have no vegetation and it's Arctic. And the flatlands are also pretty useful for being able to propagate your proximity from the capital. So on average, you can have relatively decent control. There is one last downside, and that would be the winters. The winter months are long and actually impactful because you can't build while it's winter, especially in those few hills that you have. We'll talk more about that in a second, but for now we'll talk about population. It's the one thing that Greenland really struggles with. I think this was updated between the Tinto map and the actual version of the game that I played, such that in the Tinto maps it suggests that Greenland starts with a population of roughly 1,500, but in the game they do start with a population of 3,000, which is still not great, but at least it's something. Now, in my playthrough, I just tried to build up Greenland. I wanted to increase the population, I tried to create some kind of local industry, just to see what I could do. This did lead me to have 30,000 population in the year 1517, so between the beginning of the game and then roughly 200 years later, about 180, the population increased by 10 times. Or rather, to 10 times, I should say. Now, of course, the main way that you're going to be getting that done is by asking for settlers from your Scandinavian brethren. This requires, I think it's 5 favors each time you use this interaction. They will send you 10 population per month for a period of time, which I think is 5 years. And the reason I said you'll be requesting population from the Scandinavian countries is because asking for settlers is restricted to your culture group. Or at the very least, it seems to be at the start of the game, because I was only able to invite settlers from Norway and their subjects, Sweden and Denmark. And also, I think, the Isles, who start as a subject to Scotland. So because it costs favors, this meant that I could only really do it reliably from Norway, because as a subject, you do automatically get a couple of favors each month. For the other countries, I did have to curry favors with them, but there is a cap to the number of favors that you can curry with them. Because as you curry favors, it increases the favors that you owe each other. And so eventually, if you keep on using the ones that they owe you, they're just going to be left with a whole bunch that you owe them, and oftentimes they don't ask for anything, which means that it just stays like that, and eventually you're not really able to ask for population from Sweden or Denmark. I think if you do have enough favors though, you would be able to use the invite settlers interaction multiple times at once. So for example, if I have 20 favors with Norway, I think I can invite settlers 4 times. The main point is it costs favors, and there's a chance that you could cheese this, possibly, since when you give a gift to a country, it can force them to owe you favors, as I learned after I played Greenland. So depending on how expensive those gifts are, if they're based on the size of your economy or the economy of the person that you're sending a gift to, you might actually be able to get a lot more population much faster. The other thing that made it relatively easy to increase my population was building a whole bunch of settlements. I think I mentioned this a little bit in my second EU5 video where I went over the first one, but settlements are these buildings you can build that give a flat increase to your population growth per month. So if you have a location that has, say, 0.2% population growth, and you put a settlement in that location, that can go up to 1.2% monthly population growth. So they can be quite powerful, and you're going to want to build them in every single location. The other thing that helped, of course, is also just conducting a census whenever the parliament has it available. It gives you those 6 months of 0.5% flat increased population growth. But in the early game, of course, most of your population is coming from settlers. Now let's move on to religion, because a lot of people, I'm sure, are wondering, are there any Norse pops in Greenland? And from what I remember, no, I don't think so. I know for sure that there are a handful in Norway, which I guess I'm gonna repeat when I do the Norway video, but as far as I remember, there aren't any Norse pops in Greenland at all. So, entirely Catholic. As for culture, you do start off as Icelandic culture, but I'm pretty sure there is an option that allows you to create your own offshoot. To be fair, I didn't actually check, but reading how it works in the Tinto talk, it would actually make a lot of sense. So because your primary culture is Icelandic, and of course Iceland is also primarily Icelandic, then in theory you can use a cabinet action to create your own culture, because you're not the dominant country of your main culture. So that means you could actually create a Greenlandic culture in theory. And if it were up to me and you were allowed to, I don't know, name cultures, then you might even decide to colonize into North America and name it the Vinlandic culture or something. But that's just me. Now, the main thing to talk about in Greenland is the economy. There is one immediate benefit that Greenland has, and that is its own market and a relatively small and consolidated territory. This means that most of your locations have pretty solid access to your market, and because you have your own market, you can entirely avoid the Black Death, but we will get to that in a minute. The obvious place to start with Greenland is in your raw resources. To put it frankly, they kinda suck. Now, it's not impossible to work with them, you can definitely do stuff, but it's nothing to write home about. You know, there's no gold, there's no silver, there's nothing particularly good for food either. You have a bunch of fish, so that's something. You get food primarily from fish. You can get some from wild game, I think. And then you have 2 wool provinces, which can give you some food, but it's not very much. It is worth really looking into the ivory, though, because that can make you some pretty big money. I tried to invest in it quite a bit. I don't know if that was the right thing to do, but I figured it made me a lot of money, so why not? And actually, if you see that stone that exists right in the middle there, that's quite helpful, because you have to build one building at the start of the game. That's pretty much mandatory and is really the only thing you can build. Not technically, I don't think, but you're going to have to build masonry at some point, and masonry can either accept stone or clay, so having one or the other is pretty helpful. Masonry is, in the literal sense, the building blocks of your economy. Speaking of those building blocks, there are quite a few other resources that you do have to import, so stuff like lumber and sand, because if you want to build roads, you're going to need sand, and you can eventually build sand pits, but that requires working population, and that's not exactly in abundant supply in Greenland. There is one thing that might catch your eye, and that's the lead that you see in the middle settlement area. Now, when I played, I looked at that and I thought, you know what? Maybe it can be worth something. Maybe I can make some glass, sell that, who knows? Or at the very least, I can start producing glass to build other buildings after a certain point. But honestly, it's more of a trap than anything else. Because if you try to colonize that area over there in Greenland, your market access significantly drops off by that point. And actually, fun fact, if you try to colonize up into the northwestern locations in Greenland, your location access is, I think, entirely severed at that point. So that's one thing that I would change. I would not spend time and population and money trying to settle any other part of Greenland because frankly, I just don't think it's worth it. At least up to the point where I was playing. It could be worth it to maybe set up a colonial subject that possibly has its own market, but it wouldn't have much to work with either, so I don't know. As for the things that are worth it and do work out, there are quite a few rural buildings you can build. So, for example, you can build these things called rural cloth makers, and because you have wool, you can build one of those rural cloth makers and it'll turn that wool into cloth. Another useful building would be the market villages, or the fishing villages, but I find the market ones to be more useful, because the market ones act as sort of mini towns. Whereas in towns, you have the ability to build like guilds and stuff. So you can make like a textile guild that makes cloth, or a jeweler's guild that builds jewelry. In market villages, you can use their specific production methods to build one type of good. I don't remember what all the options are. I think there are like 6 of them, which is a notable change from when they were introduced in the Tinto buildings, like the Saturday building Tinto talks they had. And I think there's something in there, either if not that building, then a different rural building, where you can end up using your wild game for something else. I don't remember if that turns it into like leather or something, but yeah, there is a way to use your wild game. Oh, also, your capital starts in a province called Garther. That's where the ivory is, and I made the mistake of deciding to keep that as my capital and turn that into a town. Which, funny enough, I'm pretty sure the student also does, which, I mean, it makes sense because it's your capital, so like, it's not even that bad of an idea on paper. But then, when you build the town, it turns out that actually it reduces the maximum amount of ivory that you can exploit in that location. So if you do end up building it and you keep your capital there, then it reduces how much you can exploit the ivory. If I were to play Greenland again, what I would do is probably move it over just a little bit. Like, instead of it being in Garther, I'd probably put it in like Siglufjord, just because that one tile produces fish, something we already have a lot of, and it's a little bit more central to your main area, so it's easier for proximity and ultimately control. When you do build that town though, it does come with a whole plethora of new options for you. For example, you can choose to make fine cloth out of the cloth that you're already making with the rural cloth makers. If you have enough trade capacity, which you should be able to get from the new marketplaces you can build in your capital town, you should be able to produce a jeweler's guild and enhance the production method using ivory. So you should be able to create a jewelry industry. It's actually one of the really important parts about Greenland is trying to become a manufacturing economy, simply because your population is tiny. So you can make a lot more money per population, might even call that GDP per capita, if you put yourself into manufacturing with one specific town, rather than trying to exploit your natural resources. To create that town, you do normally need 5,000 population concentrated in a single location, but if you have enough population, then you should be able to summon the parliament, or I think it's called the Althing, to try and promote urbanization. That can give you a free town. That's also what ended up happening in the students video. So that gives you a free town in, I think it's your capital. It could be the place where the population is the most concentrated, which will end up being your capital, because I think it gets a free migration attraction bonus just from being the capital. If not from being the capital, then from being the market capital for sure. Last 2 things for the economy. First, again, we have the fact that construction gets paused during winter, which you're going to notice as you build more buildings, which of course happens as you increase your population. And it's kind of annoying because I'm pretty sure during winter, the construction materials continue to be consumed, even though there's no construction happening. I experienced that in all three of those main campaigns, actually, the Scotland, Norway, and Greenland campaigns. So I'm a little bit more sure about that being the case. It's unfortunate because it would be pretty neat to have the opportunity to start stockpiling more supplies during the winter, or at the very least it would allow you to min-max your economy a little bit better. Next up, we can talk about the Black Death and how entirely avoidable it is. Once again, I recommend watching the student's video because he does an excellent job of showing this off, since all you really have to do is completely cut off trade. Just isolate your market, no one's allowed to trade with you, you wait it out, and then you're perfectly fine. In fact, I'm pretty sure you can even use the invite settler interaction, and I think even at that point, the settlers that you receive do not come with the plague. The other really funny thing about that is that in practice, this makes literally no sense. Because in real life, the Black Death did not actually disappear. It didn't actually get eradicated as a disease. The populations which survived the Black Death, more often than not, survived simply because they built up more immunity. So it just didn't kill enough people after a while. It was still very much there though, and so if your population in Greenland has no resistance to the Black Death, then as soon as you reopen trade with Europe, you should probably get the Black Death. In fact, there were several outbreaks following the Black Death itself, but that's really just more of a nitpick. That being said, actually, in the game, because your population actually will not have any resistance to the disease, if it does somehow break out again and gets transmitted to Greenland, then you might actually still have like the Black Death anyway. I don't think I've seen that happen yet, but again, I haven't played that late into the game. Moving on to colonization, I did briefly mention this a little bit earlier in my settling attempts of the Middle Settlement and Vestribygd, that's the little part in the northwest. To reiterate, I don't think that was really worth it because of just how much population it moves from your main area all the way out there where you have like very little proximity, very little control, and very little market access. Which is why I would say if you plan on playing Greenland in your first campaign, you should probably just concentrate your population into your capital for the most part, build up that economy, see if you can get a whole bunch more people to move over, and then instead of trying to settle the rest of Greenland, just go for Canada or something. Obviously, you can at least reach Labrador, and you could reach Newfoundland if you just want more fish, I guess. But my advice would be to try and find somewhere that has some decent resources. For example, lumber. Considering at this point you've had to import literally all of your lumber, it would be kinda nice to not have to rely on that import, since it is used in practically everything. Also worth noting that expeditions for exploration and colonization are rather expensive. Within Greenland, they're not that expensive. I think it costs very little to maintain colonies within Greenland, but I think that's because it's your main home area. So if you do end up colonizing Canada, it's going to be rather expensive. Then finally, we have the politics to talk about, because I can remember one of the crown reforms that I took, that being the harbor administration. It gives a big boost to all of your coastal locations, so almost all of them. Mostly it improves the distance cost to your capital through ports, which means that it should increase the average proximity of all of your locations, and on top of that, it also gives you 10% monthly development growth, which is useful because what I was doing as Greenland was just sitting there on speed 5, mostly letting my cabinet just develop things. And there's a really good reason for that, because the more development you have in your locations, the more maximum population can be supported. And so when we're talking about building a bunch of settlements in every possible location, you have to keep in mind that once the population of that location reaches 5% of the maximum, then that settlement gets deleted. Which means if you want that settlement to last and give you that plus 1% monthly population growth, you're going to have to increase the maximum population in each of those settlements. So development is a really good tool for that. On top of that, I did briefly mention some of the things that the Parliament or Althing are useful for. For example, the censuses for population growth. You're able to get a free town in your capital, but also you can get cheaper roads, which is a really good idea when you're working with limited resources, and you can get free RGO expansions, or resource gathering operations, the term some people use for the raw resources. So you can get a free expansion for your fish, or your wool, or your wild game, etc., etc. So that's pretty much it for Greenland. I mean, there's not a lot to talk about since it's Greenland, and also because that's just the stuff that I can remember for the most part. Of course, at this point, I no longer have access to the game, so I can't really go in there and verify what I was doing. And as the second campaign that I played, it was a little tough to see if I could actually remember everything, but after a while it all started to come back. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this somewhat scuffed recap of a playthrough that you're not even able to watch. I did my best trying to recall everything I could. It's possible there are a few things that I got wrong or a few things that I'm misremembering simply because I don't have the game anymore, so I can't go in and check. If you did enjoy the video though, I'd really appreciate it if you would go ahead and leave it a like. And of course, don't forget to subscribe because there are 2 more of these brief run recaps I'll be doing. One for Norway and one for Scotland. But for now, this is Corbett signing off, and as always, have a fantastic day. I'd like to give a big thank you to all of the patrons for this month. Everyone here does get early access to videos for as low as $1, so I'd like to give a special thank you to those who decide to donate more than that anyway. So thank you Erica, Baby Cal, Born to Dunk, Le Quebecer, Nick Steffel, Hubroot, Solo Isaac Only, AG Forero, Ben Modrum, Quiet Guy, Rosset, Torvald, Ambient Cyan, James Levy, Luke78776, Stalin DLRP, White Rook, and Robert.